Hello, we're back for round two. I managed to get it to work and I spent probably way too much time doing it. But now we have a light where the handprints actually respect the position of the light, and it also takes into consideration the rotation of the light. So this is probably a little more realistic. Again, it's probably not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was previously. And if you want to see how I got this to work, well, let's get to explaining. So basically what I'm doing is I have the shader for the handprint that we see over here. And there are a number of different handprints that have the same shader, actually. You can see here in my scene, they're all kind of sitting there. In fact, I should probably move the prints on top of the plane so they're not clipping, they're Z clipping. Okay, and basically if I come back over here, you can see here that within the shader, we are using a bunch of values that are mapped to the position of the light using drivers. So if we edit this driver, you can see we have the X, Y, and Z world space locations for the light, along with the X, Y, and Z world space rotations for the light. And we're using these using, lots of math. And if you want to slow down and pause the video and just kind of look at the node group that I've got here, the only thing I'll have to explain additionally is the get forward vector math that I'm doing in here. And again, most of this stuff goes over my head. I just, sat here and bashed my head against ChatGPT until I got it to work. But essentially, we're taking the light position and getting the vector of that light position and subtracting it from the position of the actual handprint plane itself in order to get the facing vector, and then normalizing that and feeding it into the dot product of the forward vector that we're getting from the rotation of the light. And then we're mapping it to this range. This took way too long to tinker with to figure out that I needed to go from -1 to -0.94 and then map it into an inverted range of 1 to 0, because no matter what I did, whether inverting the forward vector or using a -1 math node to subtract the value from 1 or whatever, it wasn't working to get the driver to fade. These are the settings that I managed to get to work through experimentation, purely through experimentation. Everything else here in the shader down here is exactly the same as it was in the previous video. I tried some stuff with geometry nodes, but that got a little convoluted, and I figured it's easier just to do it with drivers for these 6 values that we're pulling from the actual spotlight. Let's take a look at the get forward vector math that we're doing, and maybe you're much better at vector math than I am. But essentially, we're taking the rotation, world rotation values of the spotlight. We're creating a vector out of it through the combine X, Y, Z, and then we're separating those values out again on just the X and the Y, since we don't care about the role of the light in terms of determining the opacity of our shader. And we're taking the yaw and the pitch, and then we're multiplying it by cosine and sine on both the yaw and the pitch, or filtering it through cosine and sine. I'm not a mathematician again. And then we're inverting some of those, multiplying them back together in order to get the X, Y, and the Z values regarding the forward vector of the light itself. So again, I'm not a mathematician. I don't completely understand why this works the way that it does. I'm just happy that it functions the way that I want it to. People who are much more math and technical savvy than me will understand this stuff probably, but this gets it to work, and I'm happy that it works. But essentially, we're getting the cosine and the sine. For the sine of our yaw, which is the y coordinate of our light's rotation, we're multiplying that by -1, and then we're multiplying that with the pitch, or the cosine of the pitch, and then that gives us our x value. Then for our y value, we're just taking the sine of the pitch and feeding it in. And then for the z value, we are taking the cosine of our pitch, we're inverting that and multiplying it with the cosine of our yaw and feeding that into the z, which gives us the forward vector. I messed with inverting a bunch of values to try to see if I could understand how it works. And sometimes it would invert correctly, because for a while there, what was happening in the project is that instead of this functioning the way that I wanted it to, what it was doing was the light was actually hiding any of the handprints that were directly underneath its forward vector. And of course, that's not what I wanted. So I tried inverting it in a number of different ways. It didn't work. This is ultimately what ended up working for me, was making sure that we got that forward vector and then getting the dot product of the surface, the light to surface normal that we've normalized out, getting the dot product in relation to the forward vector of the light's rotation, and then mapping it to this specific range and using that to drive the factor of our shader. And that worked. So a little bit over my head, a lot of tinkering, but as far as I'm concerned, it actually works the way that you might want it to work now, and this would probably work. I haven't actually tried taking this and duplicating it and like rotating it. So let's try that and see if that also helps. Let's see if we can get another plane to act as a backdrop here. So let's do that. Let's see, are you clipping through? Nope. There we go. Let's try this out. Okay, so if we rotate this up, yep, it works. So I'm rather pleased with that. Obviously, you may need to increase the power or the radius of the light, or sorry, the power or the reach of the light, in order to get a more exposed light there that's visible from further away. But more or less, this actually functions the way that I want it to, and I'm much more pleased with this result, as confusing as it may be. So thanks for bearing with it. Hopefully that's closer to what you want. Hopefully that's helpful. Take care. I'll talk to you later.